Blessings, everyone. And today, my special guest is Cathy Scott. She's the author of several books, including this one, Seraphim Rose, The True Story, and Private Letters. This was a book she wrote about her uncle, Father Seraphim Rose. And this will be an audio-only interview. So I wanted to beforehand, I wanted to provide this video introduction to some of the books that have been written about Father Seraphim Rose and some of the books that he himself wrote. This book was published in the year 2000. It is now out of print, but as I will discuss with Cathy in my interview with her, she's planning on having the book will be republished in a new edition. So this is welcome news. The book is about 250 pages long in this edition. As a historian, I was trained to always look for, I don't know what to look for, but to rely upon primary sources. And that usually entails, if you, for a historical figure, for example, person that you're researching or studying, you want to look at things that they actually wrote, letters, interviews, books they wrote, things they said. This has a lot of material in it because as his niece, she probably had access to material and interviews that maybe another researcher would not have. So she did have access to a lot of letters that Father Seraphim, or even before he was Russian Orthodox, Eugene Rose, that he wrote to friends. These letters are very revealing about him and his life before he was converted to Russian Orthodoxy. And what she did, which was very important too, was that these letters are reproduced in their totality in this book. It's a double-edged sword, I guess, because she's writing about a family member. She's also writing about her family. So I can imagine it would be more difficult than writing about somebody that you're not related to. It's an honest book, and I talked about this with her. I think I remember, in particular, one incident that she relates in the book that had to do with her uncle, Father Seraphim Rose's older brother, who was punished for, I think it was touching a stove by their mother. He was punished by having his hand burned. So there's a lot of insight here, especially into, I think, childhood and the early years of Father Seraphim Rose, that I think are important in terms of understanding who he was and who he later became. Another book that is well known, a biography of Father Seraphim Rose, is this one by hero monk Damashing. It's an exhaustive book. It's over 1,000 pages. As far as I know, this edition is out of print right now. I appreciate this as a work, as a scholarly work. It's very detailed. Everyone who Eugene Rose and Father Seraphim Rose, I think, encountered in his life is mentioned in here. Many of them were interviewed. Some of the letters that are included in Cathy's book are here, not in their complete form, and some of them are not included, that she included, and I'll talk about that with her in my interview. It's a bit of a frustrating book. I read this one first. in that there's a lot of detail. It's like an exercise in the details of Father Seraphim's life, but it often avoids what is obvious, which I think is telling in its own way. Some books that I found helpful too were this one. I think this one's out of print too. I'm so sorry, but I think a lot of these are available on the secondary market. This is letters from Father Seraphim Rose that were written to Alexa Young, who Father Seraphim knew before Alexa Young had been converted to Russian Orthodoxy, and then Alexa Young later became a Russian Orthodox priest. These are mainly from the 1970s. This is probably Father Seraphim's most famous book, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. And but this is actually my favorite book of his, is my favorite work, is Nihilism, the Roots of the Revolution of the Modern Age. It's a quick read. You can read it in a few hours. You probably will and want to read it again. It's rich. As far as I can tell from my research into Father Seraphim, this was originally to be included as, I think, a chapter or a section of a larger book or work. But I think this is before the computer age. So when Father Seraphim was organizing his thoughts or preparing to write a book, he had notebooks where he'd outline and then, gradually fill in and write and then eventually type. So this, I think, was found in its typewritten form after his death or around his death. But the other chapters or sections were not. So I recommend this book. And I hope to do a later podcast just alone on this book. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to some of the books and materials that are out there and available on Father Seraphim Rose. I've been interested in him for probably about 20 years. I first heard about him when probably around 99, 2000, when I first became interested in Roman Catholicism. And at the same time, I was also interested in Russian Orthodoxy. I've always had I think at least since college, at Berkeley, where Father Seraphim received his MA, I think, in Oriental languages. And since at least then in Russian art and culture, and Father Seraphim had a great interest in those things as well. So I've known about him for about 20 years. I think I first heard about him in some very anecdotal sort of circumstances, about hearing about a Russian Orthodox monk who before was involved in the study of Eastern religions and Eastern philosophy, and lived in San Francisco, and was homosexual, and later had a conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, and then died very young in 1982. So that's what I heard about him. And then like I said, I did pick up these books, and they are invaluable. Especially, I think Cathy's book is invaluable. Father Hiram of Damashing's is also very, very helpful for those who want to know more detail. So this is my interview with Cathy Scott. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. And I'm very blessed to have as a special guest Cathy Scott. She is, in her own right, a well-known author. And but for the purposes of today's discussion, she is the niece of Father Seraphim Rose. Thank you for joining me, Cathy.
Oh, my pleasure.
You come from a very accomplished family. I kind of feel like I know your family well because I've been reading about them for so long. Your grandmother Esther was a well-respected artist. Your mother Eileen was a well-known expert in antiques
and an author.
right. And your uncle was Father Seraphim Rose,
Well,
who is a, I guess, world famous Russian Orthodox
nationally, I
Catholic
think, or
also.
internationally. But my grandfather as well, my uncle Eugene, Seraphim Rose's father, was he wrote for years up until he died for Popular Mechanics and in Two Harbors, Minnesota, where they all were from. He was a sports writer for a newspaper in Two Harbors, Minnesota in the 1920s. So we have a lot of writers, including my uncle,
Yeah,
Sarah.
I didn't know that about your grandfather. Oh, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
it's in there. It's in there somewhere. In the
Okay. Um, Now, there's been several books written about Father Seraphim Rose. Yours is called Seraphim Rose, The True Story and Private Letters. It was published in 2000, and it's out of print right now, but you were telling me that you are going to reprint it.
I'm updating it and doing some edits, and will come out in a second edition later this year. Mine was the first book out. Um, my the book about him. It's it's of course a biography and the story surrounding his life and then after when he built the monastery and all of that. We were all very much in touch with him during that, my grandmother, and he would come down the mountain, as my grandmother called it, from Platina to through Redding and down to San Diego to see her, and then we all would gather.
Yeah. Now, there's another famous book written about your uncle is Father Seraphim Rose's Life and Work. It was also, I think, earlier published as Not of This World, and that's by
Yeah,
Father Damascene.
I interviewed him. I actually went up to the to Platina, to the monastery, and that he built, and he interviewed me actually. And then when the book came out, he kind of took editorial license a little bit, trying to change history. There's something very controversial, of course, that came up, and I discovered it as I was writing it. And I believe in I wasn't, I'm actually a crime writer, and I'm a journalist by trade, so I don't wear rose colored glasses when
Right.
I write a book. So I either was going to write the book as it was, and is interviewing everybody and about his life. And I interviewed, probably 100 people, and or I wasn't going to write it, and I decided to do it, and the whole truth and nothing but the truth,
Right. Now the
unvarnished, unvarnished.
yeah. Now the Damascene book is a little over 1,000 pages. It's pretty exhaustive. Um,
Yeah, there are
but
pieces of my book in there, by the way.
yeah, but I have to say I mean, before we start talking about your uncle's life in particular, because I was trained as a historian at UC Berkeley. I have my master's degree, and yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. The book is exhaustive, the Damascene book. It's very detailed, but it leaves some some significant facts out.
Right, and that's what I did not want to do. My mother was very surprised, and she was, you just can't write it. And I said, well, I interviewed his friends, I interviewed his partner, I interviewed his co-builder up in Platina of the church, the monastery, and all of his school friends, and high school and college included. And the first thing when I got together with a couple of them, they were very gracious with their time and very generous with letters that he had written, and then I had letters as well, and one was from my grandparents to him, or my grandmother, you can't, and the first thing they said is, you are going to talk about this, right? And I haven't said what it is yet, but I said, what? I didn't know. I didn't know. And so I went back to the family, different members, talked to them as well.
Yeah.
And everybody knew where I was coming from and where they were coming from.
Yeah, I wanted to say a little bit about the letters, because I have to say that both both books, your book and the Dam Machine book, have a lot of the letters that your uncle wrote or received, reproduced.
He stole those. He stole those from his Jamison, or however you pronounce his name. He took some of those with a little bit of editorial liberty. Took them from my book.
Okay.
But he picked and he chose. I didn't. They're all in there. Every letter I got, I included. So as I said, it's unvarnished. I believe in sunshine, and I think it was very important, if you're going to tell a person's story, and regardless of whether he's my uncle. And I tried to be good to him in that. He was an incredible person, as you know, and we knew him from both sides of being a monk, and also um, as a relative. And I mean, I can remember him as a little girl. He was my mother's youngest brother, so he was 12 years younger than her. So he was, she was out of the house when he was a little boy. So he, as my mother would say, my brother was an only son.
I wanted to talk to you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think an unvarnished version without. I didn't want to do him any harm, but I thought it was important to tell. If you're going to tell a story, then tell the whole story. And I outed him basically, not intentionally, but that was the book, and that was what I learned, and so that's what I did. And he took great objection to it. The other writer who wrote after me, and took parts of it, but not all of it.
Yeah. One thing about I wanted to say really quick about letters is that we're so not used to letters anymore. I did my master's thesis at Berkeley on Jack London, and there was just volumes and volumes of his letters and
Mhm.
books, and the way people used to write is so fascinating, and write to each other. And I mean,
It's almost like,
your
yeah,
uncle's a perfect example. The letters are so rich and so detailed and so complex. These people back and forth through the mail were discussing these.
or it's like email in a slow version. But yeah, he took such time, and then sometimes and he had quite a sense of humor, but sometimes uh, he'd get quite lengthy,
Oh
but
yes,
also, so they all, his friends, they all were such intellects, and
yes.
and it's quite refreshing, actually. I mean, when they got into Ezra Pound and that bit, it got a little heavy, but because Ezra Pound's tough to read. But he studied all. Eugene, my uncle, studied all of the religions in the San Francisco area, and he took my brother to the Russian Orthodox Church, my big brother, and they were closer in age, Uncle Eugene and Michael. And um, my brother was on a fellowship or something at Stanford, and Uncle Eugene was staying at my grandparents for in between wherever, whatever he was doing. And they did walks on the beach, and my brother got to know him quite well, and vice versa, and so I got a lot of depth from my brother as well, who's a scientist. My brother is, and
He's
you know
involved in environmental issues. He's quite well known as well. Somebody else in your family who.
yeah, Dr. J. Michael Scott. He's an ornithologist, and he headed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services program at the University of Idaho, but he was on a career-long grant through the U.S. government, and Michael was in charge of the Condor Project
Wow.
in the 70s, 80s, whatever it was. And he's still, you know, he's written a ton of textbooks. He and Uncle Eugene had a lot, lot in common. And so I think that was very special what they had in that summer they spent in Carmel, you know, at our grandparents' house. Um, and so he was the first person I called besides my mother to tell him what I had learned through his friends, Uncle Eugene's friends. And, you know, it just took it in stride. It's like, oh, okay, well, I didn't know that, you know, kind of, I mean, it was, and his brother was the same way, my other uncle, Franklin. And I think we have to accept people for who they are, and you can't cover up, you know, if someone was gay or homosexual, you can't cover it up. And I think it's the reason he became a monk.
Yeah.
You know, that's just my assessment. But you know, it was the 50s when my grandparents found out. And through a letter, I believe it was, from a friend of his from high school.
Right.
And
That's what you say in your book. Yeah.
yeah, well, it is what it is. It's exactly. um,
And I wanted to say too that the things that again, I think in the early 21st century, we're not familiar with this because we're so used to emails and Twitter and things being so quick.
mhm.
Is that in these letters, people, I mean, within our generation, people were discussing such profound issues
Yes.
and talking about such deeply personal issues with each other through these letters. And there's such a great historical artifact because we've learned so much about your uncle through his letters that thank God were preserved and we
Yeah,
have
thank
them.
you. I was so grateful that they had them. I had a couple from my grandmother had from him that she saved after she died. We found some letters, you know, in her top linen drawer or something. But there it was so there were 90 or so letters from his friends, and back and forth. They saved each other's letters, and so we have the give and the take. He also had those wonderful um, postcards, you know, and he'd send postcards. What did he go to San Quentin to interview or for research of some type? And he got a postcard at San Quentin prison, and he sent it to a friend. Some of his postcards were in foreign languages, you know, German. And did he write in French? You know, he studied Chinese, but I had to have them translated, and it was just so fascinating. And like you said, it's a real picture into his life and his world, you know, coming out of his own mouth. And I think it's almost like the Churchill letters, uh, to and from his wife, you know, were just brilliant to read. And I think we learned so much about Father Seraphim Rose, and we learned so much about Eugene, who he was before, through his letters. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Yeah. Father Alexei Young, who did the foreword to your book, he also published quite a thick book on just his correspondence between himself and your uncle, which I just finished, which was really revealing too.
Yeah, such a nice man, and I haven't read his book, but I should, and I will do that.
That's really
I'll have to you know, see if there's anything of relevance in the time frame that I could include and ask his permission. But I'll have to definitely read that.
okay. And then I just wanted to say in the introduction of your book, there's a line that you write that I really loved. You wrote, "He was not, as he was previously described, in Not of This World, an angry young man. If anything, the state of the world was a sad place to him." I thought that was really, really
Yeah, I did
profound.
come first. That other book came second.
And I think you were right. I don't see
But
your
thank you.
uncle as being angry when he
Not
was
at
young.
all. No, he was a
Yeah.
very. If you knew him, it's hard to describe. there was a very quietness. I interviewed my Aunt Margie. He was actually his ex-sister-in-law. She was my other uncle's wife, first wife, and Margie, and she was closer in age to Eugene, and they lived in the same. When her, when my other uncle went into the service, Eugene was at home, of course, and Margie, my aunt by marriage, stayed with my grandparents. So she and Eugene lived together, and they'd take walks and have long conversations. She was the sweetest person, and she wasn't surprised at all. But um, she described him to me too, and it's in the book. I can't remember her exact words, but there was a quietness about him. He was an incredible listener, but still waters run deep. And he studied even as a child. I went to the Methodist church with my grandparents, but um, he um, well, he was so bright. The whole bunch of them are. My mother and my uncle, both my uncles, are very bright were, and um, he knew it, but he wasn't conceited about it. And he was like a sponge. He just studied different things that he enjoyed, and so it's fascinating. His, you saw him as a child, you would have, and he was very handsome, as you know, and he but there was just a sereneness about him. It's hard to even describe when you were spent time with him.
Wow.
Yeah, when
Now,
my grandfather died, I was 18. My twin sister and I were 18, and a cousin came up. He was a year older, and we spent about 8 days, 9 days in Carmel, and Uncle Eugene was there the whole time, and and our uncle, my mother, and then Eugene, and my cousin, and my sister and me, um, for the funeral, and just to be there with our grandmother. And Eugene was just sort of a quiet comfort to her, I think. And but he would make jokes. He would, he'd walk, we'd be on the living room floor going through books or whatever we were doing as teenagers. And Uncle Eugene would walk through and just kind of make a quick remark, and it would catch you off guard because he had a sense of humor, that he wasn't boisterous, but he would throw stuff out, though I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was funny. He was a kind person, a gentle, kind, caring person.
so that would have been in 1968 before they moved up to Platina. So
Yes, he hadn't moved up there yet, and he was still in at the bookstore. Probably we also went to the bookstore. One of our trips to San Francisco, because we would spend summers there, and so we went up to San Francisco, and I remember going into the bookstore, and he was working, and then he went to Big Sur with us, and we swam. He didn't, and I remember sitting on the bank of that big water hole at Big Sur. I
yes.
don't know if it's still there, a swimming hole. And he sat on the banks with my twin sister and me. And I just remember his quietness is what strikes me the most. But you almost felt like you were in the presence of someone who was going to become. We all knew he was going to become something. He's going to do something good with his life. We didn't know he would become a Russian Orthodox higher monk, but
Yeah.
he was. I mean, when you say not of this world, it almost. Well, there are charismatic people, and there are people who aren't charismatic, but they have a presence.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
But
In
I rambled, but if that's a good explanation.
No, it was beautiful. In your book too, I think you're very honest and about your family. I mean, that's difficult because I mean you're writing about the subject of the book, your uncle, but you're also writing about your family at the same time.
Right.
And your mother, Eileen, I mean, was very honest too, talking about her mother. I'm always interested. I mean, I've been interested in your uncle for a long time, but when I get really interested in somebody, I'm interested in their childhood.
Sure.
And yeah, your mother talked about her mother and how strict she was,
Oh, it was
and
not easy. she wasn't she wasn't easy.
And how she took extraordinary pride in her family. And I mean, according to your mother, she wanted us all to be perfect. That's difficult to grow up an environment to
Well, we
grow up
would
in.
kind of laugh with, our parents were, they have a family of five. They had five kids in a very short period of time. My sister and I are twins, and they just kind of let us be. And we grew up in La Mesa, which, they were kind of halcyon days. We had a swimming pool, and so people always hung out at our house. But we got to play, softball in the traffic circle till 10 o'clock or whatever. But they didn't put a lot of restrictions on us. Like Mike started diving. Michael, the scientist, started diving when he was in high school, and he would bring home these fish and hang them in the tree, and who knows what they were, big things, and abalone and lobster. And he would have parties when he was in college for his frat members. Nothing, or nothing. He wasn't. He wasn't a partier. My brother wasn't, but he was very social. And our mother, of course, he could have a party there, and they just kind of let us be, and but encouraged us at the same time. Whereas and I think maybe it's because my mother,
Mhm.
she was so strict. She sent her. My mother graduated from high school at 16. She skipped a grade, and sent her to business college because women. She didn't want to send her to college, and she sent her to a business college. She met my dad, and got married at 18. And my mother got her college degree when she was 62 years old because it
Wow.
was so important to her, and that opportunity was not given to her. And then she raised five kids. So, um, whereas Eugene was the prodigal son, and he could do no harm, but she also was strict. And and my mom used to say she kind of felt sorry for him when she moved out. He was, so she was 12 years older. So he was 4 years old when she moved out at 16, when our grandmother sent her away to business college. And she said she always felt sorry for Uncle Eugene because he had to be raised there alone because she was so strict. Um, but she corrected our grammar. she she made sure that we spoke well. She would sit down with us and do our homework with us, but she didn't want to be bothered by the little kids. We were told to leave the room if they were having conversations, and go play in your bedroom, because we couldn't be there with the grown-ups. That was how our grandmother was. And Eugene spent a lot of time in his bedroom.
But
Margie told me that, and because she lived there, and so she tried to kind of pull him out. They'd sit on the porch and talk, and because she said he spent so much time, our grandmother let him get a dog, and he would spend time in the bedroom with the dog. And I think it was kind of a lonely time for him, but I think he also learned to be with himself and learn to be alone, because not everybody is good at it.
no, no.
But
You,
I think you say it was a window, and thank goodness I was able to interview people like Aunt Margie, who actually spent time when he was a teenager, when he was a boy, in the house. And I thought that was about a year or two while our other uncle was in the service. So I got lucky in
yeah.
getting some great interviews.
You wrote this too, which I think is really revealing. You wrote, um, with his brother and sister both married, Eugene lived as the only child in the Rose household. He learned to deal with his mother's domineering personality in the same way as his father, by sitting quietly, seemingly complacent, yet not necessarily agreeing with the way she saw things, but not arguing with her either. I think that's very revealing.
Thank you. Yeah, you couldn't you couldn't win an argument with her. She was quite prejudiced, and came from Two Harbors, Minnesota, and but not overtly, you know what I mean. But she would say things, and we were, none of us, thank goodness, that died with her. So I never had any issues with my grandmother, and I think that's it. it's true about my grandpa Rose and Eugene's father. Um, he was a quiet man, but I remember him. He did woodwork and he would carve, and he would take us down to into his garage. My grandparents in Carmel, they built the house themselves, and there was a studio, art studio above the garage, and then my grandfather had his workshop, and he had a lot of woodworking type things, and he'd take us into the dark room. He had a dark room in the studio and show us how to do. To develop my twin sister and me. He would show us how to develop um, pictures, and I'm still fascinated by the time that how lucky we were that he showed us that, and especially because that's not done today as much. And Eugene, I think, survived by he watched my grandpa, and he was very much like my grandfather in so many ways. They walked a lot. If you knew Eugene, you would see he was kind of awkward, so very tall,
Yes.
lean, and he would put just his thumbs in the corners of his pockets, stand there with just his thumbs, both of them, in kind of the corner of his pockets. My grandfather did the exact same thing. My grandfather was much shorter, but he sort of took on traits of my grandfather, and they used to take walks together. So who knows what they discussed? But they both were very quiet, and it's yes, it is how they both they both they had a good life, but she wasn't mean really. She was stern, very stern.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it was her way or no way, but she didn't argue about it. Nobody argued with her. Nobody fought. There
I
wasn't
bet.
any fighting going on. It wasn't that. Those were in the days when something came up, you didn't talk about it, you
I
know?
bet.
So,
Yeah.
so there was never any, I don't ever remember my grandparents ever arguing, and we spent a lot of time with them. So he didn't grow up in a household where there was fighting, you know.
Yeah.
He grew up in a quiet household where our grandmother dominated it.
Yes. Yes. Now, this is a particular interest of mine that because a lot of the research that I've done, but there's certain psychologists and psychiatrists, especially of a very Freudian
Oh,
persuasion, would say that, a young man sometimes raised in a household like that with a domineering mother and somewhat of a passive father is more likely to grow up to be, homosexual.
yeah, I don't know what the thinking is on those these days on that sort of thing. I mean, my uncle Franklin grew up in the same household. Only Franklin was more. He's a very charming man, and they all look alike, But he just a very and not outgoing, but friendly, and not well, you read the passage in there where he caught the kitchen on fire, right?
Right.
And what she did, she held his
Yes. That
5
was
years old,
that
held
was
his hand.
awful. I
Yeah,
gotta say.
it was horrible. Yeah, that was abusive. But she
Oh,
didn't. Yeah, she didn't. You can have your children taken away from you for doing that. But she back then, corporal punishment was approved, but she wasn't. She wasn't a spanker. She wasn't. My mother remembers only being spanked by her once. I think was our grandmother had put a pie in. She cooked a lot, and she had put a pie in
yeah.
a tree to
Your
cool off, and my mother put her foot in it and accidentally climbing in, and she spanked her. But
You
he
revealed
wasn't.
a oh, I'm sorry. You revealed a memory of your mother too that was really surprising and honest. And I mean, I don't know if it was difficult for you to reveal, but that your mother's mother was not demonstrative with her at all. And she said not at all, her mother. She didn't.
No, they weren't affectionate. None of them
Oh,
were. I remember hugging my grandfather and him just being sort of awkward. And our grandmother she would give us a kiss on the cheek, and she would make this, how you suck and you make this loud kissing noise. That was her big thing. She would kiss us on the cheek, but there was no hugging, no no embracing babies or anything like that, and no animals. And but he was, Eugene was able to talk them into letting him have a dog, which I think was wonderful. But um, no, but we didn't notice it because it wasn't there. So it wasn't like we noticed it. They were very stoic people. They came from, from New Zealand, or from Norway, and then they went to Minnesota, and they got farmland. At the United States government gave our great great grandfather farmland in Two Harbors, Minnesota, and that happens to be where a lot of Norwegians are. And they stayed there, and then it was my grandparents, after they got married, moved to San Diego when my grandmother was 21, because they couldn't stand the cold. And and on Lake Superior, it's quite cold up there. But it was a beautiful, beautiful area. And she may have been that way. And for her part, my great grandfather couldn't get a job after they followed them. They had a house fire in Minnesota, left the farm, and came to San Diego, and he couldn't get work. And so he worked at Belmont Park, which is on the beach and it's quite famous, but it has a big roller coaster. And so they would take the trolley from downtown San Diego, my grandmother with the kids, and then my mother, when she got a little older, she would take them from the downtown trolley to Mission Beach and hang out at the park where where their grandfather was working. And they had family picnics, they had family get-togethers. They went back to Minnesota on vacations. She loved Balboa Park. If you see pictures of them, they're always outside at the beach or at Balboa Park. So he had a there were always family member get-togethers, always no drinking, nobody drank. And um, so he had the library was nearby. Everybody, all of us always went to the library as kids, including them. And so, I mean, it wasn't like that was like that all the time. You know what I mean? It was just the side of it, but they gave their kids a good, ra- rounded childhood, aside from the, no affection and the
Yeah.
sternness.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other things that really drew me to your uncle's story was that, I mean, I was born and raised here in San Francisco, and
Nice.
yeah, there's so much, because so much of his life happened there. I know he was born and raised down in Southern California, but then after he graduated from Pomona, I guess in '54, but before that, he
He
had
spent summers there at a
right,
bookstore.
exactly,
Yeah, as
and
a teenager. Yeah.
it's so fascinating because he was there um, in the North Beach area, which was the hub of the Beat Generation at that time. So
Oh,
he was
sure. Yeah, and he spent time with the beat poets. I mean, I was fascinated by that too. There's that bookstore, what's it called? Light.
City Lights.
Yeah, City Lights. I've been there, but that's where Tony Serra,
Yes.
yeah, Tony Serra, I've covered a trial he was in, the attorney. That's where he chose to be. But and the Russian Orthodox Church is not that far away from there. But yeah, he escaped San Diego and went. I think it was a family friend or a school friend or a teacher who got him that bookstore job. Didn't he
Hmm.
do that 2 summers in a row?
I think so. Yes. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
between his freshman and sophomore year, and then yes, and
Yeah,
and then and then
yeah,
he met, That's another fascinating thing. And then he met Alan Watts, who was
yeah,
kind of like the Timothy Leary of the '50s, and he came. Alan Watts was teaching at this Academy of Asian Studies,
yeah.
and your uncle sort of followed this new age sort of guru up to San Francisco to study with him at this academy while living, in sort of the North Beach area, with all the beatniks. It's so
And
interesting.
and they walked everywhere, and they went to theater, and they
Yeah.
went to concerts, and they went to, because it's all in the letters, and it was just wonderful. They take the trolley everywhere or just walk. I don't think anybody had a car, and I think that I mean, I think he was escaping. He didn't come back to San Diego. He moved north, but and then my grandparents, of course, moved to Carmel, and I think in large part it was to be near him. But
Mm.
she was also an artist, and so she studied under some great artists up in the Carmel, Monterey area. But that was part of it. And then she was there. My grandparents' Carmel house was sort of the home base for him, but for Eugene. But yeah, it's a fascinating. It was so fun to read his letters, and then I got to write about it because how special was that? The Beat Poets and
Yes.
Alan Watts, my gosh,
And he met Jack.
wrote
He
Jack.
met all. He met all of them. And
Yes. Well, they
he
hung
was.
out in apartments together too. So they were just hanging out and philosophizing. And I forget once, didn't they meet them at a poetry type reading? And that's how they kind of connected and they got together. And then he went to the training, whatever that was that Watts had started and met some of those other ones. He was hungry for knowledge, Eugene was. And it was almost like he was searching for himself, and he was doing it through poetry. He was doing it through, like I said, Ezra Pound. He was reading, you know, all the great, poets, and but also studying religion. That was his big deal, was studying religion. He landed at his choice was a Russian Orthodox Church, but he studied Buddhism. We thought for a while he was going to become a Buddhist.
I think he was very, very serious, and
Yeah,
that was a really bohemian. I mean,
so cool.
lifestyle. People talk about the avant-garde, but that was kind of the last of the real, because those people were really, they were really living it
It was
at that time.
pre-hippie. Yeah, pre-hippie. And I think, yeah, and what a cool place. I mean, it was just so cool and how lucky he was. And, he wasn't he was shy. And so it wasn't like he uh I don't know, it's sort of the age of sort of freeness and that sort of thing. And it was more of an intellectual drive, that he had. And he was so stimulated by other intellects, people he could talk to at his level, which was so great that he had that, you know.
And he was really, that group in North Beach at that time was really ahead of its time, because
Yes,
I mean later in the 60s, with the hippies and the flower power and even the Beatles, who got interested in the counterculture and Eastern philosophy, that was much later,
yes.
but they were doing it 10 years before, 15 years before that.
Yeah, they kind of broke the ground for others. It was, it was, I mean, and what a joy for him to have been a part of it. Although while they're living it, they probably weren't aware of it. But what a cool environment and a support system and everything else he had. And his college friends were just a good group of people, you know, and and they all supported each other, and he didn't. Eugene didn't hide anything about himself when he was in college. They all knew.
Now, yeah, yeah, this gets to the, I don't know,
The
it's,
sexuality, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It wasn't like, yeah, it's not. And Walter, his friend in high school, and that's how my grandmother found out, was she read a letter from Walter to Eugene, and it might have been when Eugene was up in San Francisco at the bookstore in the summer when he was still in high school, and Walter actually went up to visit him. I interviewed Walter, and he didn't like my grandmother, but we all loved her. We just accepted her. She didn't damage us, you know, because we didn't take any of it at heart. But she wasn't physically, abusive or anything. But other than that one awful thing that happened to my uncle, but I think that he was open. He wasn't open in high school, but in college he was. It wasn't like openly gay today. It's not the same thing. It's like they just knew, and it wasn't a big deal. Nobody talked about it. It wasn't a lifestyle or anything like that. It just happened to be his bend. And you can't help it. It is who you are, and it is who he was, and he was accepted by his friends, and I think that must have been very comforting for him, having had such a bad reaction from my grandmother. But they sent him to a psychiatrist.
Uh, that's well, at that time that wasn't unusual.
Yeah, normal. Yeah, but poor Uncle Eugene having to go through that, and he just was who he was. But it wasn't. I mean, back then it was. People didn't talk about it very much. You know,
Very
in the
little.
family, it doesn't bother anybody in the family. I mean, it just is. It just was who he was. He wasn't. He wasn't. He didn't. It wasn't going through multiple partners or anything like that.
So
And I
yeah,
think
nine.
he
Yeah,
joined the church, and I think that was the reason he became a monk, for that reason.
yeah.
He
So
almost
oh,
married
I'm sorry.
in the book too.
Oh, sorry. Say that again.
Almost married. Did you
Who
see
would that?
that part?
Was that Allison?
That was the sister of oh, what's his name? The guy who went up with to the church with him, built the church with him.
Oh, good.
Oh yes, yeah, Gleb. Yeah, and that was his sister, and he was friends with her. She would go a lot of places with them, and and my grandmother was thrilled, and it was, and then because then he would have been a priest, and it would have just been for looks, but then he would have been a priest, and so he gave up the possibility of a priesthood, and instead became a monk and then a higher monk.
Yeah. So yeah, in 1956 he wrote this letter, yeah, to his friend, where he said that, yeah, your grandmother, his mother, had found this letter
Yeah,
between him and another man, and she assumed that he was a homosexual.
yeah, and she never told anybody. My mother didn't know. I called my uncle Franklin, and he just kind of chuckled and went, "Oh, I'm not surprised," and no big deal. And Margie, um, I told her, the ex-wife of my other uncle, and who spent time at the house with Eugene, and it wasn't she wasn't surprised, wasn't unsurprised, you know what I mean? It was just, oh, okay.
It
Very,
was,
very
yeah,
accepting. And it would have been nice had he been able to be open about it, not knowing that the rest of the family wouldn't have cared. It's just like, oh, I mean, it's not any big deal. So that's why, and right, and including that, because how could I not? Um, how could I edit anything out that would be not right? And um, I knew that it was going to have a big impact, but it just was who he was. So and then other priests, or that one particular one, wanting to say it wasn't true. It's like that is a false reality. If I can
I
go there,
I don't know. Reading. I mean, you know more the inside story than I do, but
they were quite upset. They were quite upset.
I believe it. But
Yeah.
from reading Damashene's book, it just like it wasn't covered.
No, he just ignored it. He ignored it, and it was like, what bird? I don't see a bird. Do you see a bird? It's a false reality, and how can you possibly write, especially to go on and on the way he did with it? How could you? I didn't make it a big part of it, but I did unfortunately out him. The only person who didn't, and the publisher, who was a Greek Orthodox press, was not Russian, but Greek, was, um, we had great discussions about it, and how to approach it, and just kind of matter of factly put it out there. And it wasn't.
It's a little bizarre. There's a movie from Italian director, what's her name? Liliana Cavani. She's kind of a strange director, but um, she did a movie about St. Francis with Mickey Rourke as St. Francis. It was bad casting, but there's an interesting scene in it with Helena Bonham Carter. She's always good in everything, and
Mhm.
she played Claire, and it's after Francis's death, St. Francis's death, and she's sitting around with the monks, and they're all going, "Well, what are we gonna?" And they're thinking about writing his life, and they're all going, "Well, what are we gonna put in it?" And they're going, "Well, should we put this?" And she's like, "Just put everything in there," because St. Francis had kind of a colorful life before. So, I
You have
mean, you have
have
to know. You have to.
you can't just because, and one person from the church told me that I ruined my uncle's chances of being sainted.
Hmm.
I know it takes years and years because they apparently had already started the process of it. And I ruined his chances. Well, how, if I'm, again, if you're going to write a story, how can you do it? I don't think that's on
I
me. I
I
think
think
it's on them.
I think you improved his chances.
Oh, did
Be-
I? Thank you. Yeah, because I think he wasn't a bad person or anything, so I don't know how it changes anything. The family accepted it. My older sister is gone now. She died, but she was upset and said she understood I was writing an expose, and I said, well, I don't write exposés. I just write biographies. So I mean, I am a journalist by trade, and so I write the facts. Um, and I told her at the time, how could I write a story and not include that facet of his life? I would have had to edit out letters. I would have had to edit. How could I live with myself and put something out that's not true? And it's like,
I think, I mean, I'm coming from a Christian perspective and as somebody who's had my own conversion experience, but I think, I mean, your uncle's life is very much like Saint Augustine. It's very much like the prodigal son. It's a conversion story. I mean,
yeah,
for me, I mean, for different people, it might be something else. I'll take something else out of it.
yeah.
It might be someone is on a search or a quest for meaning in life or truth. But for me, it was very much a conversion story. And without the conversion, there's no story. Or
Right, yeah,
there's
and it did change everything, and I look at, I look at the way he died as well, was pretty awful, and
yes,
and
horrific.
and that was unvarnished in there, and I was at my grandmother's, staying with her and talked to the doctors, and because she was the one giving permission, and
Wow.
she had a hard time hearing him on the phone, the doctor, and he fasted for months and months at a time, and his intestines were just gone. They were gray. They didn't have a color anymore, and they were dying. And um, you do have to use your intestines, and he would fast for 2 months at a time, and he did that for years. And that's what the doctors thought was the cause of it, because he had no underlying disease, no cancer, no anything. There was no cause for it. We don't have that sort of thing in our family. And diet, as you know, what we put into our stomachs or what we don't. It's almost like bulimia, but um, Karen Carpenter. But I'm the one who approved on, via my grandmother, the surgery he had. And then afterward, I just think the way they carried him, and there's that above ground, uh, grave, and it's quiet in his little cabin. My grandmother stayed there 2 separate times for a week. She went up and visited him. I think that's in there, but I live in a tiny home and I live in the mountains, and so I feel kind of a oneness with him because he did love nature and the mountains so much, and it was such a moment for me to be up there and go into his cabin where he slept and where he typed, and it is quite moving.
And then you interviewed oh, I don't know how else to say it, his partner at the time, John Gregerson.
Jan.
Jan, okay.
Now the J is silent. Yes, Jan
He
was
was,
such a nice man. Oh
is
my
he still living?
I don't know. I interviewed him with Walter. Walter was there. One of Eugene's friends. What is his name? Van Buren or something like that. He lives in La Jolla. He um, he owned a bookstore for years, and so he knew Walter through Eugene, because Eugene kind of cut off Walter, and then they did go visit him, and then they would talk to him, but it got to be where he didn't want. It's like he didn't want that his college friends as part of his life. He'd moved on. You know what I mean?
Mm,
It's almost like he put those things aside, just as regular,
mm.
you know, heterosexual friends. And then Walter, who was his I don't know, just on and off maybe for a short time in high school, and then because it wasn't, according to Walter, it wasn't that long of a relationship, but the physical part of it didn't last for years or anything like that. It was very short lived, but I think Eugene had a great deal. He felt a lot of guilt about that, and which is unfortunate. And um, well, Walter is kind of a crusty guy, but
Is he still living?
and bitter probably. I haven't checked. I'll have to check, but very bitter, and which never serves any purpose. Jan is very gentle, just a sweet man, and was he left him. Eugene left him for the church. They were together up until he decided to go.
I wanted to ask you, this is from your interview with him. This is what Jan said. He's referring to your uncle Eugene, as he became more and more Orthodox, he did not share my view that one could have a homosexual relationship and remain in the church. Once he became Orthodox, he emphasized the fact that any relationship between us in that sense was over.
Right. And I think that just, don't you think that speaks volumes? That's why he joined the church. I think it forced him to kind of put that part of his life in the back of his head, that he would no longer be um, homosexual. And it's too bad because of that era that he had to do that. But I really do think that was his out. He was no longer, you know, and I isn't that sad in some ways?
From my perspective, no.
No?
Yeah,
Oh,
no. I mean, because I'm like, again, I'm someone who had a conversion story similar to your uncle's,
oh, okay.
and I think like me, I think your uncle was searching for a lot of, I think the truth, I think for happiness, like we all are. I think
Right.
for yeah, for a purpose in life, and I
So
think
God gave it to him, and he didn't need that part of his life anymore. It's like priests being celibate. So it's like that portion of their life, they they put it aside, but it's not a sad thing. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, I think in Russian Orthodoxy, everything just came together, and
Yeah.
I think it was a philosophy of life. It was a religion, and it was a set of moral doctrines that made sense to him, and I think everybody that encountered him in Platina, he was happy. I mean, I think
He was happy.
of
Happy.
anybody there, he was the one people were drawn to.
I mean, just for
Well,
the reasons that you gave too, the peace and the joy and just his demeanor. So
yes, and he loved the mountains. So my grandparents, when he was growing up, they lived on a canyon, and now it's developed, but it was off of 31st Street near downtown, and he um, we used to play in the canyon, and it was just right there. Their house was literally overhanging the canyon, and he used to spend time there and go walking. And then he loved nature. And when I remember being in Big Sur and walking with him, and the giant. In fact, there's a photo of us out by the big swim hole, I think, and next to leaning, he was leaning against redwood, and so were we. And it, it, he just was one with nature, I think. So being in Platina was just kind of a godsend for him. I think it was, yeah, he was very happy. He was content to be in his little cabin and write. And he translated the works of the great fathers in Russia, right? And the first time the West had ever read any of those, that was a monumental thing he did.
yeah, he
And
was a genius with
yes,
languages. I
well, the whole
mean,
bunch of them are, the family, my mother, my uncle Eugene and Franklin, they all were, and all excelled. My grandfather worked at the city schools and got into the paperwork and got all of their IQs off the tests. But he was a genius, but in a different way. He was like a sponge, and in search of. It's almost like a cliche, and in search of a purpose, and and he found one.
yes,
And
yes,
but it's almost like he was in pursuit of it his entire life.
yeah.
And especially when I think when he went to San Francisco, I think that was probably in that summer, that was what made him blossom a little bit, was he'd found he'd found where he wanted to be.
Yes, and I don't think as somebody that as he did, as he embraced celibacy, and I think we already talked about this, but I don't think he was a curmudgeon or he was a grouch or a grump.
No, not
Be-
at all.
Yeah,
No.
because the church or ultimately God, had required this of him. I think it was something that he embraced, and I think it was something that fulfilled his life. So
Yeah, he wasn't, he, like I said, he had a very soft demeanor, very sweet, but very, but you would look at him and he looked strong. You know what I mean? He wasn't wimpy, and he had a strong, uh, I mean, when you looked at him, you knew he knew who he was, and he was quite comfortable in his own skin,
yes,
aside from the awkwardness of you know carrying himself, kind of standing awkward like my grandfather. But thumbs in their isn't that funny, the things you remember? But I think it says a lot for, he's kind of a gangly guy because he was so tall and grew tall very, very fast. And but he there was a you look at the photos and you can almost see into him, you know.
mm,
You probably get that from him too.
mm.
It's
There's
almost like looking at photos of Jesus. There was just a peacefulness about Eugene,
mm,
a quietness.
yes. There's a really sweet memory that you put in the book. I think it's your cousin. Um, I think it's Franklin's son. I think
Oh,
he
Frankie. Yeah.
yeah, he was home from college and he had a I think it was the last time he had a discussion with his uncle, and he talked about they were arguing about, I think, evolution, or not arguing, they were
Discussing. Yeah.
discussing, thank you.
Discussing.
And because I don't, your uncle, and your cousin made it clear, your uncle was very gentle with him in this discussion, and he wrote, or he said to you, I never saw Uncle Eugene again after that afternoon. in grandmother's living room. We lived
That was
so
at
far.
the funeral. That was that week at the funeral where all of us stayed.
Yeah.
That was when he spent time with Eugene.
And he said, I often wished I could have had that conversation with them again. This time it would be completely different. Instead of trying to persuade him to my bankrupt point of view, we could have had a wonderful time of fellowship about God's amazing creation. Because your cousin, he became a Christian,
Yeah, I
and
think he did. Yeah.
that
Well,
that was such
we all were raised. We all went to church growing up. All of
such a
us.
beautiful memory. And do you have a favorite? I guess to kind of sum up our conversation, do you have a favorite memory of your uncle that was just, that you have?
Well, I think I remember sitting, I remember always thinking how nice he was. And I was kind of impressed because he worked at the bookstore at the church, the Russian Orthodox Church in San Francisco. But I'll tell you a funny story. I don't know if I included in the book. I haven't read the book for a while, but my uncle's current wife and the wife at the time, Patty, um, when Uncle Eugene came down the mountain, as my grandmother called it, he drove a truck down that my grandparents had given to him, and and my uncle walked in, and my uncle Franklin walked in, and his wife Patty, and Eugene stood up, and he always wore the black cassock, of course. When we After he became a monk, he always wore the cassock, and and Patty, when she was introduced to him, she goes, "Oh my God, I thought you were a myth. I finally meet you." And he just kind of and
It
Eugene
was in your book.
is it? Yeah. Eugene just smiled, and I thought that was such. And I remember my sister and me, my sister and I, when we first uh, saw him for the first time, because he came down quite a bit, and I remember we hugged him and how stiff he got, and he just kind of backed away because they're not. Now I don't know if that's because he didn't come from a family that hugged. I think my mother always hugged him, but he just stiffened, and I thought, oh, he's a monkey. He's not supposed to hug people. And we just kind of, my sister and I afterward just kind of giggled about it. But um, I think I think overall what struck me was his, like, he had to be on a special diet when he visited my grandmother, and she always had those things available. But I think the kindness at the time that we got to see him kid and stuff with us uh, at the funeral in '68, at the house for a week, where we all were together and kind of just did our things. But I do remember him and my mother spending time, because my mother just adored her little brother, and I remember she would laugh and he would laugh, and they spent such quality time together during that week, all because our grandfather died. It brought all of us together. And that was the only time. That was the last time. And other than my grandmother's funeral, but not everybody, including Eugene, was there, or my grandmother. So it was those moments in life, you don't know that that's the last time everybody's going to be together like that. So it was very special as I look back, and I think it was very special for my mom to spend time with her little brother.
Did you ever go up to Platina when your uncle was alive?
No, my grandmother did. I was a single parent, and working, and and my sister as well. But um, I just didn't. I well, we weren't invited, but but we could have gone up with our grandmother when she went. I don't know if there would have been space to sleep, but we could have stayed down in Reading. But it was a very big deal, and the planning in advance of her going up there, and because life at the church would exist, because they'd have a lot of priests move in and out. I think there was a lot of training or whatever. It was a monastery, right?
Right.
And so life went on while she was there. So I think it was disruptive had any of us gone up there with her. I would have loved to, but she went twice and thoroughly enjoyed it and all. But he would write to her about deer on the property and the plants, and because she was into that sort of thing. And they had a lot of deer on their property in Carmel, and she used to feed them apples. And um, so I think that the nature was a very, very big deal to be up there. And she took walks, and he walked with her and spent time with her, and so it was very, very special to her.
How you described real quick that you were on the phone with the doctors when your uncle was dying. How did they inform you that he had passed away? Did they just called?
They called. We stayed up all night waiting, and I was she called me, and she was distressed, and so I went and spent the night with her and stayed there. And it was in the middle of the night when they were doing the surgeries. It was all very matter of fact, and they didn't think it. They weren't sure it would save him, but it was the one chance, and I think they did. I think it was, I don't know if it was two surgeries or one. And um, she was sad, but she was also very stoic. I think the only time I saw her cry was once after my grandfather died, and it was in the kitchen, and she had dropped something or something. Then she just burst into tears. It's the only time I've ever seen my grandmother cry. And I don't. She may have cried alone about Uncle Eugene. She was quite distressed and upset, but she didn't. She just kind of, they rolled with things, something like, here he is. It's an enormous thing. My mother was in England at the time. She lived in England for 12 years. So my sister and I helped take care of my grandmother. She died at home. My mother was home by then, but we took care of her and would buy her groceries and clean her house and bathe her and do everything and let her live at home. And um, so it was just another thing to do for her. And it happened to be about Uncle Eugene. So it was quite upsetting because she wasn't there and none of us were there. And um, but the doctors described how he got there, and they drove him down and that sort of thing, and then the condition he was in. And there was no sign of cancer. It was very matter of fact. And then that we were waiting to hear how the surgery went. And I'm trying to think how long after, it's in the book, he had surgery and he died. But I was there, and we just got a phone call directly from the doctor
Hmm.
to her. I gave the phone to her,
Hmm.
and they told her.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then she was going to, they wanted her to go up for it. The church did, and a lot of the members, but she said no, he belonged to them. It was there. She was older, and she said no, he belonged to them. He belonged to the church. And I can't remember. She might have gone, but I don't think so. Um, it's in the book, I'm sure. I can't remember, but I know she was hesitant to go if she did go, because she felt
She was not at the funeral. Yeah, no,
yeah, she was.
she was not.
Yeah, no, she wasn't. That was why she just felt it was personal for her, and that he belonged to them, and that they were going to do it the way they do it. 'Cause she was Methodist,
Hmm.
and he grew up in a Methodist church, and yeah, it was just sad. Not, I know I cried, but she didn't. Um, maybe in private, but it was just very, very upsetting for her. She didn't have a whole lot to say.
Hmm.
There were a few belongings they sent to her and things like that.
Yeah. The one thing I can tell you about, I think, the impact of your book and the work that that you published about your uncle is that I've talked, and I'm an observer looking outside Orthodoxy, is that I've talked to different Russian Orthodox priests, and they say that when they speak with someone that is struggling with homosexuality, apparently like your uncle did, some people don't, and some people do.
Mhm.
And when they have somebody before them, they do tell them about Father Seraphim Rose of Platina, and
Really?
say yes, and to say, read about his life and pray for his intercession to help you. So, I think your work has had an impact
Oh,
in.
thank you. Well, the family accepted it, and it's a shame um, that my grandmother didn't, and that he had to feel that way to almost to the point where he escaped San Diego, but and none of us knew. My mother felt bad because he had struggled with it because of my grandmother, mostly I think, and she felt badly about that because she was unaware that was
Yeah, I think send and I may be making some inferences that aren't true, but I think San Diego in the 1950s was very different than San Francisco in the 1950s. So
and
I
we were
think it,
kind of a small town back then, but I mean San Diego's a cool town because always has been a lot of surf.
yeah, but I think
Always
it was
has.
much more conservative. And I think if your uncle
Yeah.
at that time was looking to maybe explore, other realities or other ways of living, San Francisco was a better place to do it.
Probably more accepting, but we did have the Hillcrest area, that was there then too, where a lot of gay people lived, a lot of gay men. But yeah, but you're right. It was probably a little more conservative, and San Francisco was such the Haight Ashbury and the whole the
Right.
Beat Poets and all that. It must have been such a relief for him because his letters were from the ones he wrote from his time at the bookstore, and how he just walked and he felt so free. I mean, he walked all of the whole, in Europe at the top there in North Beach, and you walk down to San Francisco. I've done it. That's a walk. And Eugene was a walker. That's what he always did. And so I think he felt like you say, I do think he felt like he was home.
Yeah.
He very much at home in that area. And then lo and behold, our grandmother followed him up to the area. But poor Eugene. But she didn't badger people. They never talked about it again. It never came up. They
Yeah.
never, it was like, that's the way it was back then. It wasn't an issue. Nobody was told. And it was like my grandmother tried to bury it. And unfortunately, Eugene had to work it out on his own.
And I think he did. I
Yeah.
mean, people might not, especially nowadays, I think people would look at Uncle as saying, he was repressed or whatever.
No, he
But
wasn't, I don't think.
but I think the conclusion that he came to is not everybody's, but it was
Right.
his, and it was made him happy. So, you know,
Yeah, and I don't know what kind of a reaction my grandfather may have had. I know that had my grandmother, when she would get mad at somebody, she would stop communicating. So she didn't write to my mother, because nobody made phone calls back there. Long distance was expensive. And so she didn't write to my mother for something like 2 months. And I remember my grandfather instead wrote her a letter. And then when they finally, saw each other again, or started communicating again, it was probably something silly. And I remember my mother said something about our grandfather had said just something brief to her. He was a man of few words too. And he may very well have, my uncle may have, my grandfather may have said something to Eugene to make him feel better, to kind of temper what my grandmother's reaction was to learning that he was homosexual. That may be something that we don't know about, because my grandfather was a very kind man, just like Eugene.
Hmm. Hmm. I think your uncle's legacy is very much, I think it will live on. I think through his writings,
Thank you.
but
Yeah.
but also through I think his life. And your book has been so important, because I think without the full story, I think we don't, as you talked about right from the beginning, I don't think we have a clear picture of who he was and who he became. So
Yeah, it would be missing. I mean, I think Pomona was very freeing for him, he blossomed. But did you see the Pomona magazine article that was written when my book came out?
I did, yes.
They did a wonderful job, I thought, and I have to reread it, but it's been a while. But I thought, they kind of embraced him, and such a brainiac, and such a good contribution at the college at Pomona. And and it's nice that they recognized him by writing about him. I thought that was nice. And then his papers, um, I think all those letters and papers and that sort of thing, I do believe I donated them to, I don't have them because I donated them to the college.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure I did that.
I hope future historians, look at, I think there's a lot more that could be written about. So
Okay.
about it.
Well, and when I go back over this, I'll go through and see, and I'll try to reach out to some of his friends again too, and see, because I wrote that in 1999, and it was I think my second and third books. I think Eugene's was my third book, and now I've written 13. But um, I've changed as a writer, and also I think it's going to bring back, just talking to you has brought back more memories. But I think if I go through it again, and conversations I had with my family after the book came out.
Thank you so much, Cathy, for talking with me.
You're welcome.